Recording, okay. Egyptian asked me to do that. Okay, let's start with the ongoing topic of processes. I asked you to do a little bit of addition to your process that you shared with us last week. Did you all manage to do that? Okay, so why don't, let me see. Okay, maybe Santiago, do you want to start? Do you want to
Yeah, sure.
can
I'll
you share your...
Of course.
Get rid of this bit. So.
Just 1 second. Can you guys all see?
Yes, yes.
Make it a little bigger.
Okay, so what did you find that you could...
So it was both from Danny's process, which was really detailed, and one of the things that I hadn't put there, one that I didn't even think about, but that I really do, is highlighting the problematic parts at the beginning. Like if there is something I don't understand or something, just highlighting them or making a note of something that this I don't understand or this or whatever, and I would put that inside this one when I'm still reading the text, even before the strategy of translation, anything. Just okay, this is what I'm struggling with. Just when I'm reading, just to get a sense of what's going to be difficult, what's not going to. And then another one that I found also on Danny's was, and I would put that in while I'm translating the literal version, just before the loop. So I translate each part because I'm doing it by parts. I check for the literal meaning, check that the strategy is there. And then once all of that, I go back to the difficult passages. And then I read again, like I compare again and again and again, just to make sure if I don't get it, and if I have to, I ask somebody or something like that. I thought those two were good additions to these.
Okay, yeah. Would there be, if you've identified some difficult passages already, that are further on in the text, would there be an advantage sometimes to sort of trying to translate them before you start the big translation?
That's a good idea. I hadn't even thought of that. Maybe something that would happen would be that I might lose some context in the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably a good idea. That's probably even good, kind of putting these two together, where I could probably even anticipate problematic parts, and of course, practically sometimes the time you get with whoever you can ask questions to is limited.
Yeah.
So maybe it would depend on that a lot, whether it's if you can do it now, just you've already highlighted those, or just go for it, or something like that. But yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Nice.
Thank you. It looks like it was a useful exercise.
Yeah.
Nerea, what did you find?
Okay, do I have to do the sharing? Wait. Desktop process. Yeah. Yeah, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Let me make it like this. Well, I understood the exercise was to take one sentence for each of the processes. So my lawyer mind, read every process and what would I adopt?
Nice.
And I was thinking like group, actually teamwork, like if we had to translate, yeah. So what would I add in my own procedure just to get outside of my habit, or what would I add? So from Santiago, I thought checking the accuracy of the strategy regularly. He puts it quite down in his process. So I found that interesting, that I wouldn't, once I would start, I would just keep on going with my initial idea. I didn't think about coming back to those decisions. So maybe to reflect on that would be interesting. Then from Drupchen, I noticed he put the sentences into paragraphs. Because I haven't done...
I think he was, I think...
It is sentences, not Tibetan.
Yes, because he's thinking about the Tibetan, from Tibetan to...
Yeah.
So this is not a general...
That's it. So that is something I found interesting, because I haven't translated from Tibetan. So it's something like in the languages I have translated, I would automatically have the paragraphs. So restructuring in the first draft already, as you do the literal meaning, also structure the, how do you call it, the parts of meaning, the groups of meaning in paragraphs.
Okay.
So that I didn't think of. So I found that interesting. From Danny, an interesting point I found, which didn't even really occur to me earlier, is to ask. To ask when I cannot, because I'm so used to finding answers by doing research online. That is an idea new to me, to ask a Lama or another translator, for example, about their choices of the terms. And that I've been asking Drupchen there, where can I do research? Where can I do when I don't know in a text? Where do I look for? And so to keep in mind that maybe other persons can help.
Okay, yeah.
And I found this interesting in Katarina's exposition and process, like allow time, that the importance of letting time to let the things settle, not only after you finish the text, but if you can in between parts, to let it settle down. And maybe you come back to it more fresh, or, you know, with other ideas.
Great. Yeah, that sounds like you found some very interesting things there that you hadn't thought of.
I noticed a difference as I was reading the processes. It was very interesting, because what I thought was very obvious, the way of translating to me, is not so. It's actually a personal thing, that you think like everybody must do the same because it's the only thing that occurs to you to do. And actually is not so. Like, for example, I noticed Drupchen would check the source text and the target at the end of the process, while I would rather make sure that I understand the source and make a literal translation, make sure I understand the meaning. But once I have the meaning and no more doubts concerning the meaning and the content of the text, then when I do the second part of the process of translation, I almost wouldn't look at the source text. I know what the meaning is. Maybe not the whole text, but parts by parts. Like I forget completely the way, because I have to think in my target language to make it proper language. So I don't check anymore with the source. So that I found interesting. It's just two ways, probably, to make sure that you have everything, but I would forget that in my second process. So I found that interesting, that there are other ways of translating, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
As many as persons, probably, but
Probably,
I never thought about
yeah.
that. I never thought about it.
Well, this is definitely, you know, what we're doing. You know, this is what we're doing in this module, and of course, it overlaps with what you're doing in the other modules of your training. But yeah, we're doing this. We're looking at what we think, you know, is obvious, and checking whether it really is, or whether it could be done a bit differently. Whether we could, you know, sometimes we'll find that these things, you know, well, that wouldn't work for me, and that's fine. You know, everyone's different. And other times you think, well, I'll try, you know, maybe it'll work for me, you know, I'll have a go. And maybe afterwards you decide, no, it still doesn't work for me. That's fine as well, but it's, you know, you need to try it and see. Great. I have a couple of points, but I'll come back to them afterwards, after Katarina. So what did you find, Katarina?
Yes, and concerning this that we are saying, I mean, there's also the possibility that we act differently from a type of, if we are working in different types of texts. Right?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So it's this kind of process can differ. So actually, my process, of course, was not finished because I haven't finished since last week. But anyway,
Katarina.
Yeah. But anyway, from what I had, well, Nerea prepared the glossary. Maybe the idea of the glossary as such, I wouldn't think of. But that's a good idea.
Yeah, that's true.
Because of course, if we note the problems and we highlight things, but maybe the glossary is also very useful if we have the time for it. And in Danny, I also chose this highlighting of the problematic parts, but maybe like you were saying, because I think that if we are doing a translation, of course, we are going to have problematic parts and we are going to identify and deal with them. But maybe like you were saying, Santiago, that we could, at the beginning, if we have time to read the old stuff, right, to highlight already so that we are aware of this, because probably then we can, you know, have a more, let's say, a balance made before starting. Then in Santiago, check the accuracy of the strategy. Yeah, I mean, the strategy, we have different words for what we mean the strategy, what we include in the strategy. But yes, checking accuracy might be a good idea.
I think it was referring to the last. I think it was on the last session where when we were talking about the strategy. I think Craig can correct me. We were talking about like who are you going to write it for and all of those. There were different things of like who is it going to be for and all of those things. I think they were. Was that in the textbook, Craig? I don't really.
The textbook distinguishes between sort of strategy and procedures. Yeah.
Okay.
The strategy is the more general sort of direction, and the procedures are what you do for each individual sort of part.
This reminds me, now we are talking about this, reminds me of this part of a video that we saw of the SADR conferences, where a person refers to the consistency of tone, more related to poetry, but it's good because sometimes, yes, if it's a big work, we might lose track of certain things. And then we get to the end of the book with a completely different tone than we had at the beginning. So it's like here it's good to check the strategy and consistency of our tone, or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah. That was, yeah.
Do you remember that? Do you remember, Santiago, the video?
Especially when they were talking about when like a book of sutras or something that they would get so much, they would understand the words so much better by the end, that once they were doing a collection, it would seem the same translator. It would seem as if it were two persons if you compared like the first sutras to the last ones.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's obviously it's very different if you're doing a short text or if you're doing a long text, you know, I mean, but also, you know, I do lots of short texts for the same client. So, you know, I'll get sort of press releases and short project descriptions over the course of years. I've been working for one client for over 10 years now. So there's lots of consistency questions that come into play then, because obviously I have a different understanding of their topics now than I did 10 years ago. But they also have a different, and then, I got into trouble once with them because a different department sent me a translation to do. And I was just translating it in the same way, and I, being consistent and thinking I was doing it well, and I got complaints because actually that, the website, the publicity, the sort of, the publicity department have a different use of the language than the project department. And so, the project department was like, well, we don't like this translator. I've been translating for you for 5 years, and they were like, yeah, we don't like the way you're doing it. And I was like, oh, okay.
Change personality.
So, but it's not huge. It's a big NGO, but it's not huge. But still, they have different, and they hadn't told me because they're not translators, so they didn't know that I need to know this, and I didn't think of it. Maybe I should have thought of it, but I didn't. Obviously, if I get like a project funding application that gets sent to the government, that's a totally different language, and it's completely obvious. But this wasn't. This was sort of project description and things like this, and so So you're always dealing with these issues of consistency or differences, or where does it need to be consistent? Where is it different? What's and you end up with like 4 different colors of highlighting while you're going through, at the beginning, where you're marking the difficult passages, you got a sort of one bit where you think, well, this is a difficult word, that's in yellow, and then another bit, oh, I need to talk to the Lama about this, I'll highlight this in green, and then, or idioms, I'll highlight that in blue, and then by the time you sort of have got through the first draft, you've read through it, it's all multicolored and you can't remember what the code is. It's like, what does yellow mean? Do I have to talk to the Lama about that? Or...
this is the theory of the rainbow.
So you don't want to make your process too complicated. But at the same time, what we're doing now is that we're training, so now is the time to make those mistakes, now is the time to make a process that is too complicated, because you will realize that. And by the time, we finish the training, you'll have narrowed it down and simplified it to the one that works for you. But if you stick to a simplified process now, you'll never learn the benefits of adding in those stages. So now is the time when we want to try things out, and we want to overdo it sometimes. Things like structure. So I made a note that was Santiago who sort of said the sentences to the paragraphs issue, that Tibetan has a different structure. It doesn't work in paragraphs the same way that our languages tend to. I have this with German sometimes. Now, German and English are very, very similar, but I do find that my German authors often finish a paragraph with a sentence that for me should be the first sentence of the next paragraph. They sort of like make their emphasis at the end of the paragraph and then start, and I would sort of come to an end and then start with the message of the next paragraph. Now, I don't know whether that's typical English or whether that's just my preferences, but it occurs quite often. And in German, they don't use semicolons like we do in English. They just don't like them as much. And so, things like this, there were small things which the emphasis at the end of the sentence instead of the beginning of the sentence, or whatever, those sort of things which we'll get into in the linguistics section. But what I was particularly reminded of was in the field of English teaching, a lot of international students come over to the UK to study, and particularly if they're, maybe sort of at master's level or something like this, their English has to be pretty good. So often they'll come over and they'll do an English course for a year before they start their arts degree or their science degree or whatever. And there's a real issue which has to be taught, and that's how to structure a scientific essay. Because particularly with the Chinese students, and there's a lot of Chinese students in the UK at the moment, or the pre-pandemic there were, there's just a different structure to the whole document, the whole way of sitting down and making your essay. We're not talking about paragraphs here. We're talking about how do you start with the conclusion, with building up your argument, and with coming to the conclusion, presenting your results, and all this sort of stuff. There's a whole different mentality of how that is structured. So if you had sort of a Chinese scientific essay that was written in Chinese and you were translating it into English, you might have that issue. You might have sort of, well, it doesn't fit the structure of an English, this sort of abstract introduction, presentation of this, presentation of that, and so you would have to think about whether you want to fit it, to that structure, or whether you stay with the original structure. And that would obviously depend on what you're doing. I mean, the same as we've been talking about. If you're preparing it for publication in a English language journal, then you're going to talk to the authors and say it has to be like this. If you're just translating to know what was written in the original, then you leave it in the structure of the original. So it can be even more than paragraph issues. Is that the same in the field of law, Nerea? Is there differences across the world with legal arguments?
I didn't do it long enough, and what I did was, some contracts which are more or less the same, and then the Court of Justice decisions. That's what I was looking at, and they're set exactly same structure in different languages. So don't have that question at all.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind, but we'll be talking about that at different times. But it crops up all the time, this sort of thing. Another note I made was the genre-specific comment from Katarina that that the process will be different for different genres. Of course, that's you're going to be definitely looking at that source text again if it's sort of a more accuracy based genre, and you're probably going to forget it earlier on in the process if you're translating poetry. There's going to be a difference between that. So you're going to adapt it. I adapted as well for my commercial work. There'll be different. But I think the key for me, one of the key things which needs to be in your process is this clarity of what am I doing in this process? Am I looking at the source or the target? Where's my emphasis here? And to have at least one each stage in your process where you're sort of not looking at both. That's because you're going to get trapped in one or the other, and so you need to sort of balance that, but you also need to take advantage of that. So at times you're going to be sort of blocking out the source text and sort of concentrating on the target, and at other times you're going to be doing it the other way around, and at other times you're going to want both of them there for the comparison. And to have an awareness that those stages all need to be somewhere in your process, I think, is an important point to take with you. Short and long, we've already talked about that, so that's good. Okay, well, you'll be looking at those documents again. I mean, this topic of process is something which we'll be returning to a few times. But if you're happy, we'll move on from that now. Okay. What time is it? So let's have a look. So let's do your other homework task was the timeline entries. So we'll move on to the sort of the substance of this week, which was the chapter, the historical stuff. And we're in the early phase. So I asked you to look for someone who stood out for you. Who did you notice? Let's have a look. Probably best if I share the screen because it's just one document, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's have a look. We can get that formatted. Wrapped around. Sorry, I'm just making it look a bit nicer before I share it.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I? Too many windows open
Yeah. One of my favorite parts of the day
Many
is once I'm about to power everything
do
down,
they
just
have different
close them.
colors?
Okay, let's have a look. I'm not a great. There we go. Google Docs is. I don't work in Google Docs that often.
It is weird. It is weird.
I'm so used to working in the Microsoft software that I'm just
Excel just yeah.
I just sort of get lost sometimes.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can zoom in on this. So someone shows Saint Jerome. That had to be
Yeah.
patron saint of translators. Okay, so that should all be on screen now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Santiago, tell us why you chose Saint Jerome.
Well, what I really liked was that one of the things, of course, the patron and like one of the first ones, and his quotes are cool and all of that. But I think one of the biggest things were that even though everybody was, it was very controversial, he was the one who was kind of inclusive enough to look at different translations of the Bible, to create his, or to help, or to put this or that. That he not only looked at I have it here, the Greeks. No, yeah, that he didn't only look at the traditional reference, the Greek Septuagint, but also the Hebrew. So he was looking at the Hebrew, and so he was the first one to notice the difference and open like this huge thing we have now, where once we were a few weeks ago, we translated up some parts of the Bible just as an exercise, and we looked at all the different types and like that have all the difference and all of that, which was really interesting. And so he was the one who started that, and then also set the precedent for translating sense for sense, at least in the West, I would say. So going for not word for word, but going sense for sense. So going for the meaning that could be better understood by your source public, target public target.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think he mentioned something where he would stick to the more literal translation. Do you remember?
Uh,
Nerea?
yeah,
Or-
that I caught my eye, and I'm noticing that you took a version that is not the last one in Google Docs, because I added that point.
Ah,
I was thinking from Saint Jerome, yeah, that he would adapt depending on the text.
Yeah. The if it were the
whoops,
do you-
sorry.
if he said, it didn't say gospel, but it said something else. It was the, yeah. I got part of this from the timeline, not the text. All right, that's probably why.
Yeah.
But wasn't but was I don't know, the sense for sense, yes, but wasn't the Bible the exception for in terms that one has to be careful,
Yeah.
very careful
Uh-huh.
about
Mhm.
how you choose the words, and so I think that he made this exception for
Mhm.
the Bible.
I
But
understood
from
in
what I
the-
remember, but I didn't.
Yeah. It was this famous quote, right, of saying like, hey, for the gospel like this, but then for some other text, not word for word, sense for sense, or something like that, right?
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Nerea, do you remember exactly?
what I understood, because I wrote it down, that's why I remember.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not showing because I
It's
just
okay.
opened up this document. So
It's okay, because I do remember, because I was, it's a question that was on my mind. So when I got to the Chinese, I thought, okay, here is the question I've been thinking about lately. But then I was thinking about it and I thought, yeah, Saint Jerome, he made the same point, like depending on the text, he would remain closer to the text in the sense of not word for word, but paying more attention to the words, the syntax of the sentences, because of the nature of the text.
yeah,
So it's not that you change the way you translate, it's because of the importance of the text, the weight of the text. You just pay more attention to that. And that, yeah, caught my attention, because it was what the Chinese one, the Da one. I got the same point, you know, the attention of the style of the original text. What was interesting is in this period, the people had a better bilingual command of the languages and the expertise of the subject. That is not him saying, but is in the period. Actually, when this translation comes, people have more experience of this type of text. That I found was interesting. And then, yeah, his theories of the three difficulties that I found, in other words, in the Wikipedia, was communicating the Dharma to what made difficult the translation of the sutras was that we're communicating Dharma to a different audience from the one the Buddha addressed, that the words we are translating are not any words, are the words of a revered person with some kind of authority. So that makes it different from other texts. And then the third point, translating, is also that there's a corpus of texts. It's not only the first words, which on top, we don't know exactly what is the source language. Everything is like translation of translation of translation. That's another thing. What's the source language really? But the third point was translating texts which have been painstakingly composed by generations of disciples, the comments, and they have also this authority, have been practiced, have produced some results in terms of realization already in people. So they carry this kind of authority, I would say. So that makes this type of literature a bit different, I find.
Great, yeah. And Katharina chose the same
Yes,
person.
I mean the book also. I mean, yes, it's true that I had chosen. I saw the timeline, and I chose Dawan. How do you say Dawan?
I think it's Dao An.
Dawan, and actually the chapter was spoke about a bit about Dawan, so I profit from that. So yes, to summarize, this is what I say here. So he identifies the losses and difficulties in translations. So he had a good grasp of what was this set of differences. One was linguistic, and the other relates to the social and historical contexts. So he was quite organized in his head to separate these things. And then, yes, he realized that he had a difficult task, which was the translation of sacred texts, but at the same, and so there was this kind of how do you say, constraint, let's say, when you think about the authoritative nature of these kind of texts. But at the same time, what happened at that time was that they had lots of different versions going on, spreading, scattered around, because people transmitted things by oral transmission. So actually there was a kind of flexibility in these texts, which it's a bit interesting to see, because he's I don't know, if you are a translator, you're translating something, yes, you think, oh, this is you have this difficulty because it's a sacred text, but then you go to another version and see something differently written. So it gives you a kind of freedom, maybe, that probably with just one version you didn't have.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking of Daoan. Look, oh, that's good, a new version. I can do it in another way.
I have a justification for doing it the way I want to, because it's also there. Yeah.
Yes. So
I'm not sure that's we should be encouraging that completely, but yeah, I think I understand what you're saying.
It is in the text, it's there. It's
Yeah,
in the book.
yeah.
I mean, it does not say how Daoan felt, but I can imagine that it was a difficult task anyway.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Great. Okay, so I'm going to just jump back to what we referred to with Saint Jerome, with when does he use word for word, when does he use sense for sense? And as Nerea pointed out, that there's an overlap there, because Daoan points out that when you're translating the words of a saint, you have to be very careful. And I think that's sort of what Saint Jerome was maybe referring to as well. I'm not at all a Christian or a biblical expert, but in the quote that they put in the book for us, then he says that, except of course in the case of the Holy Scripture, in capital letters, where even the syntax contains a mystery. So then he would translate word for word, or close to word for word. Now, without having read more than just this quote, I don't know how he deals with translating sentences that have a mystery within them, because for me, this is one of the big questions in Buddhist translation is, well, it's actually the same in any translation, really. I mean, if I'm translating a medical text, do I need to be a doctor? Because should I really understand everything in every detail of what this medical report says, or can I, understand it with my educated mind and translate it anyway with the help of a dictionary? And if I'm translating a holy text, sacred text, do I need to be enlightened? That counts me out. So I can go and find another job. But yeah, so how do we do this? How do you translate a mystery? Do you have to understand the mystery, or can you translate the sentence preserving that mystery?
I found some interesting choices made by a Chinese translator in the 7th century. where he says 5 things when translating from sutras shouldn't be translated, should be transliterated. I was one looking at these Chinese people and he's called Xuanzang, and he calls it the 5 untranslatables.
The 5 untranslatables. Yeah.
5 instances one should
Sounds
transliterate.
interesting. Mhm.
So transliteration means giving the idea of how it is pronounced in the foreign language. So we get no idea of the meaning. I had to check the definition. So these 5 things are secret words, secret things like dharanis and mantras, things that are supposed to remain secret. The second is words that are polysemic, when they have different meanings, like Bhagavan.
Mm.
When words have so much meaning that you just leave it the original. The third one, which is a choice, is when these things don't exist in the country, like in China here, like the jambu tree. In that case, he would leave the original. The fourth is, out of deference to the past, translations that are already established. He wouldn't change that. He gives the example of Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi is already established as Anuputi. So everybody understands that. He doesn't try to bring in a new word. And the fifth one is to inspire respect and righteousness. For example, prajna instead of wisdom.
To inspire what, sorry?
Respect and the sense that it is right. So he would leave prajna instead of wisdom. This is an author from a translator from the 7th century. And lately, Kempo David said that Karmapa asked him to use prajna instead of wisdom. I found that very interesting.
Those are super interesting.
That's a nice little list. Very nice.
Yes,
Where did you find that?
That was interesting. It's in Wikipedia. I have it.
Okay.
I'll send you the link.
Katarina, you wanted to say something?
This topic of the maintaining the words which are established, we also saw in some of the videos. I mean, if you have the word already established, don't put another one like samsara and nirvana. Why to make an effort to put something else? Well, if people already understand these concepts.
What if they understand them
incorrectly?
Well, incorrectly.
Or you could understand them better with something else. Like,
yeah.
If you come up with a good idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, for example, many early Buddhist translations into English were translated in an era when there was still a lot of Christian influence on the language. So terms would have become established then, which had a very a color, a connotation, which maybe now 50 years later, 80 years later, we think was not appropriate, or but then
could be improved,
yeah. So what do you do then? Where's the border between deference to the past and
yeah, because they say also, like, translations have a time and an audience, but also a time. So a translation may be very well adapted for a certain time, and a few years later is old-fashioned, not appropriate. So yeah, this balance between respect of what has been adopted and proposing something new that you find maybe more adapted to time.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure, I think it was Samsar Khyentse Rinpoche who was talking about the difference between when everything was first translated into Tibetan and now how we're translating. And he was, if I remember correctly, right, he was saying that it wasn't going to be the same at all. Like, now the way the language is moving and that the way things, culture, everything changes, that you will probably have to retranslate things every couple decades, or you just keep retranslating and retranslating just so that it fits with the same changing culture that is changing now in Tibet. The culture stayed practically the same for centuries at times. So that's kind of like a new thing that we have going on, right?
Reminds me of, for example, translations of Shakespeare into German. At the time of Shakespeare, there were obviously not, huge numbers of people traveling all through Europe and experiencing it. But there was, there were, especially the ruling classes, did, so there were some early sort of translations, but there was I think it was maybe 200 years later, 150 years later, when there was a big wave of translations into German of Shakespeare's work. But they were all very in an era where they're, very romanticized, and also, a lot of some of the cruder references. Shakespeare has a lot of rude jokes, basically. He was writing plays that were performed to loads of people standing around, and they'd been watching bears fight in the morning, and they came to a play in the afternoon. This was the working class. This was the television of the day. So these plays have lots of jokes in them, about prostitutes and I don't know what, chopping people's heads off and all sorts of stuff. So this was all sort of like, really mild and in the German translations, there was an example of some in Romeo and Juliet where they're comparing a woman to a peach or something like this, and it was like quite obvious what they were talking about. But this sort of got sort of a little bit sort of pushed to the side, or mild, or left out because it doesn't work in German or something like this, And then sort of like now there's some new translations come out. One very famous translator spent sort of 30 years translating every single work of Shakespeare again in the last, he died fairly recently. And he managed to get some of those jokes back in, sort of some modern versions. But also he didn't use modern language. He still kept it sort of, didn't put modern references in that would be totally out of place in Shakespeare's time, but sort of did it in a more modern style, in terms of what we're talking about in terms of translation theory. He did it in a style that tried to preserve the authenticity of the original better. So, there were many sort of translations of Shakespeare in, over the years, over the centuries. And I actually heard an interview with a director in England at the Globe Theatre, which is sort of a reconstruction of Shakespeare's theatre there. And he said he's jealous, of his German colleagues, because they have all these translations to choose from. He says, and says, they're justified in doing it a bit differently because they can say, well, it's a translation. He says, but I have to. If I change the language of Shakespeare, then I'm making my own version, and everybody criticizes me. So I have to sort of like stick to this original text. So I can't use translations, whereas really we need a intralingual translation, from sort of 16th or 17th century English to 21st century English for people to understand. So, we had this with Don Quixote, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a break. We've already sort of come very nicely into topics that I wanted to discuss after the break anyway. So we've made a start. Hopefully Drupchen and Danny will be back by the time we resume. So let's take a 10-minute break and carry on.
See you guys in 10.
See you then. Okay, yeah. So a neologism is creating a new word, basically. So, let us say that, we want to talk about prajna, but we don't want to use this transliteration because it doesn't mean anything. But at the same time, we decide that wisdom alone is not the right word in English. So we, would think of a new word. Maybe we would combine something with wisdom, and then this becomes a new, maybe we invent a new word like mindfulness. I mean, it's not completely new, because the word mindful has existed in English anyway, in a sort of a very sort of underused way. But yeah, the word mindfulness as we now use it, it's new. It's a new word. It's a new meaning, effectively. So yeah, so what do you think of this quote then? So what stands out from this claim? Is it a bit different to what we've just been talking about? To me, it sounds a little bit different to what Zhao An was saying.
Yeah, isn't it kind of almost the opposite? Like one is saying like from what is coming is so like holy, just keep it, and like it kind of like, at least for some things you keep and you kind of try, and the other one is like change, like use the translation to change the way even people think or their culture and all of that.
I mean, this is part of the languages, the history of languages themselves, right? Because this happen all the time. I mean, right? I suppose I don't know every language, but when you think of our languages, we see that we always have importation of terms, right?
Can you think of a couple of examples?
I mean, I was thinking because, for instance, in Portugal, we are so much influenced by the French more at an intellectual level. But yes, I don't know. Now probably I'm not going to remember which is the usual. Let me think of something. Yeah, but for instance, we have all names of cakes which come from the French. And actually, in Japan, there is a word for a cake which is pain de l'eau. The l'eau, the cake they have in Japan, it comes from Portugal. They didn't have the word, so they used the word. And actually, I think fish is also our word. Has to do with our word. Oh, and they sing the Hawaii guitar, little one.
Ukulele.
Yes, it comes from Portugal. Do you know, Santiago? You are near those islands. But you see, there's so many things that happen to our language all the time. Languages. And now with the digital age, what happens?
Yeah.
To all of us, to all minorities.
I remember when I was in MacLeod Ganj, there was a little Beans coffee house cafe. It just started, and later it became like 3 stories, but it just started when I was there, and it was sort of down in a basement, and it was the only place that was sort of open very, very early where you could get a decent espresso. So I quickly made friends with them. And I was talking to him, and he was saying, oh, we just use the English words in Tibetan because there's, you can't find Tibetan words for Americano and cappuccino and things like this. I was like, English words? But it's the same with the technology, isn't it? The sort of which language is the language of transport, the sort of you know, the original idea maybe then sort of gets brought somewhere by English or by the, you know, by the Americans or by the British or whatever. So it's sort of, we think of it as English transporting the word, but it wasn't originally.
And so today I was in the lesson, Tibetan lesson, they were saying chocolate. I was pointing to the chocolate and she was saying chocolate. So it's really the sound chocolate or tomato. So they have no, they probably had no, they had chocolate much after our culture. So our Western culture, I don't know, when the chocolate was, I don't know, what was the century, 14th century, 14, or I don't know when the chocolate was created.
It actually was a long time ago, but it was only in America.
Yeah, that's it. And the cacao was exported to Europe.
Yeah. But for you guys, it's like you said, Katerina,
Middle Ages, yeah.
14,
around the 14.
14 or 16 or
Yeah,
whatever.
once
Maybe
they
in
conquered,
Tibet,
once they came.
maybe in
Yeah.
Tibet was just 20
But
cents.
they stolen it. They
20,
stole it
yeah.
from Mexico.
Yeah.
Do you have chocolate, Santiago, in different ways to the way we have chocolate?
Not really. I think it's the product has been the process, sorry, has been kind of standardized everywhere. So it's very similar. One of the things we do have that's different is that we put chocolate in some of our like salty foods.
Yeah.
It's a really, really traditional Mexican dish. And it's one of the best dishes in Mexico. Mole.
Mole.
But with what, Santiago?
So like it's a
Chocolate
sauce that they put that you can put like
It's a
in
sauce.
it's a sauce that you put on top of things.
Meat and fish?
Traditionally it's called tamal, but it's kind of like flour, like kind of like a burrito, but imagine the burrito was flour instead of tortilla.
Okay.
Okay. So I think with the chocolates, you know, this is a good example of something coming from one culture getting sort of changed as it came to Europe here, you know, becoming something that's very sweet and, you know, lots of sugar and things, and then going back to the land of its origin and becoming the dominant form.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah.
Yeah. And that happens, of course, with language too, you know, so I'm sure Catarina can tell us about Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese and things like this, because I read some interesting linguistic stuff on how the Brazilian Portuguese is sort of coming over to Portugal and changing things, although it was originally, of course, taken from Portugal to Brazil. I have an example from psychology, because, you know, Freud wrote in German, of course, you know, because he was German speaking. And so in German, in the original Freud texts, he talks about das Ich, which is the I, you know, the word for I, like I am. But in German, they can easily make things into a noun, so it just becomes the I, you know. And so the English translator was faced with a problem, because like writing the I was a bit confusing and a bit difficult in English. And so I presume, I don't know, I didn't know the translator at that time, it was a long time ago, but I presume they could have written the self or something like this, but he decided, probably classically trained as they were back then, to take the Latin. So he translated the Freudian I with the Latin ego. Or ego, I don't know how you pronounce it in Latin, I don't speak Latin. So this was basically just the same as das Ich, you know, das Ich in English became, or in German became ego in English. But now in Germany, if you're talking about all this stuff, you're talking about psychology, then for your everyday German who's interested in this psychological stuff, they're two different things. You have das Ich and you have der Ego.
That's crazy.
Because ego has come back in from all the American, Anglo-American psychological sort of thought. with a different meaning. And ego is like a negative thing now. So ego is really sort of like your negative self, your overblown sense of being very selfish and egotistical. And das Ich is just like self, you know. And so you have these two words which were originally actually just the translation, you know, so back and forth. But coming back to the quote, I think there's something more serious sort of going on. There's something much more significant than these isolated sort of words that get translated.
Yeah, because it seems quite heavy that a translation of something would change. It would establish new systems of thought, like the strategies, not the translation itself, obviously, but the strategies of how you translate something would affect so much on what would become like such a big culture, right?
So how what do you think? How obviously the translator wasn't necessarily thinking he was going to be doing this in you know, over this is a process that happened over centuries. But what do you think was?
I wonder if it's individual decisions or is political decisions taken at a larger scale. I'm thinking, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century, when television started in Basque, which was mainly an oral language, not very much written. So it's a very recent process. My mom studied linguistics in Basque. So I remember she was talking about, and she did university just 1 year earlier than me. So, you know, it was very interesting to follow her studies. She was saying, like, at a certain point, mid 20th century, they have to decide for all the new words in Basque, the technology, are they taken from Latin or Spanish, or do we make neologism? So I'm thinking about these bigger decisions are political. You have to decide if you speak about the tool to speak in the distance, or you use the same word in Spanish and you make it the article in Basque. But these are decisions that are made at another level than individual translators. And in that sense, I can see it can configure a way of thinking.
Okay, yeah, so this is sort of
and a political relation to the language. It's the power of the language also. Affirming your own roots, you have nothing to do. You want to take some distance from the original and prove that your language is strong enough? Or do you accept the importation? So I think there's this choice also to be made. Do we take neologisms or do you use transliteration? I think all of that is in the game we are weighing.
Interesting, yeah, definitely. There's I mean, I think probably what this quote is referring to was not necessarily these sort of large-scale cultural or political decisions, but they're definitely relevant.
I wonder if it's specifically talking about the Quran or other Islamic texts or something like that, or is it just everything that was translated into Arabic and into the Islamic culture? I'm not sure.
Did they translate from Greek?
Yeah, we're talking about the you know, the classic Greek texts, so medical and philosophical, and you know, the early scientific texts, things like this.
I see. So it's not necessarily about the religious text then. Okay.
Well, that as well, yeah, but. Any thoughts, Katarina?
Yeah, I don't know enough about this process to have an idea. Yeah.
So think back. What were we mentioned when we were talking about some of the Buddhist translations, the sort of a lot of the early wave were done in an era where they were influenced a lot by Christian thought still, because there were a lot of missionaries who were the ones out in these countries exploring, or the cultural, the colonial powers. But the last 50 years has been maybe shaped by more psychological, the Jungian and Freudian, and these sort of thoughts were much more in the minds of the people who were interested in Buddhism. So maybe the translations have been affected by that. How would that, how would that influence our understanding of Buddhism?
Well, for starters, a lot bigger, probably a larger, what's it called, pool of words related to the mind than before that, or something like that. Maybe like it, especially since in the last 125 years, at least in the West, the study of psychology has grown so much that just so many new terms have been cropping up that if it were prior to that we would be translating, I think we would have, we would even have a more difficult time, just because of much less terminology before that.
Okay. Yeah.
What else? Maybe also just how much more it's open to speak about, or things like that, things of the mind and all that. It probably gives an influence on what kind of words you can translate to in Buddhism. I think it probably, if it weren't more popular now, we would have to probably use, I don't know, maybe even more kind of medical-ish terms whenever referring to the mind or referring to something like that. So I think it might help to make the translating into Buddhism more less formal in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, the sort of the target cultures, where they are, as you said, 50 years ago we were at a certain stage, now we're at another stage, and so we have more resources or to translate, and it's going to reach a different audience.
Yes, I was thinking how when Buddhism came into the West, and it was much more through the Zen, and people now, anybody can say, oh, you are so Zen, like saying, oh, you're so calm. This is an idea that one got from the beginning of the times, that Zen is to be calm. So you say Zen, oh, you're so Zen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a neologism. You're so calm.
You're so Zen, you're so calm. Yeah. So do you think that's has a negative side to it? Do you think our understanding of Zen is being diminished because of that?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, that was somehow connoted after a while with the New Age paraphernalia, but for Buddhism, I don't think it's harmful. It's only a very narrow perspective to look at of what is Buddhism, but
yeah,
it's not harmful.
Okay.
Just like you said at the end, I think it might oversimplify things, right? On a whole vast amount of work on the Zen tradition, that it might just oversimplify, and in a way could lead to certain malinterpretations, you say, right?
Misinterpretation.
Misinterpretations.
I was wondering if it would be possible to have neutral translations. Like I was having two thoughts at the same time. First, that it's good to have different translations, different layers, because they are from different angles. So you become much more aware of the relativity of translation. And you keep this awareness that there's a distance with the original text when you read translations that come from different angles. So that keeps that awareness. And at the same time, I was wondering, would it be possible to make translations without those angles, trying to be neutral? You know, when the lamas listen to somebody explaining their problems, I've been interpreting, and what gets my attention is how they remain neutral. This presence is welcoming what the person is saying, but they don't put forward anything of themselves. It's just receiving, you know, being neutral, to be able to hear everything that is being said. And I wonder if that is possible in translation, to respect the text and be able to hear it, to read it. You would have to know the context. You have, of course, huge knowledge, but to what extent isn't it that what we should aim at? If you take the psychology point of view, you're already using the vocabulary in a certain way. If you come from Christianity, you also use some words that are connotated. I wonder if the objective, I don't know, if it's the thing to do, or if it's possible to remain as neutral as possible in receiving this and give it back, you know. You see what I mean? Not
Good
so
question.
much specialized, yeah. Because then you take everything from the text, with even the controversies, with the, you know, not taking already a decised point of view when you approach the text. Don't know. I suppose a philosopher would read a text in a different way as a doctor, or so can we lessen that, or is it even the thing to do or not? I don't know.
Especially with a written text, you don't know who's going to be reading it and when, so it's even more difficult to sort of tailor your translation to the reader. You know, if you're a lama with people who you can judge their reaction minute by minute, then you get a feeling of how to speak, don't you? You know.
When you're interpreting, for example, orally, you try to not put anything of yourself and respect what is being said, and you're just, you know, you're just transmitting without trying to make a choice in the way it is said, trying to respect as much as possible. And this is the interesting part of the exercise, trying not to decide yourself that this word, you don't like it, or you would say things differently. You know, I wonder if that can be done when you write.
Yeah, there's an interesting paper. An interesting paper I was thinking I might bring to one of the lessons, and they talk about the transparency of the translator. So is the translator transparent in terms of like see-through? Do you see the translator, or do you not see the translator in the text? You know, so because there's good and bad things about that. You know, so. What I want to try and do is to think a little bit beyond the particular text, and to think much more in terms of a society or a culture, and maybe also to think in terms of time scales, which are a bit, you know, longer than maybe it's easy to imagine, because we all have our lifespan and we can maybe, you know, imagine what it was like for our parents, but thinking back 100 years, 200 years is a bit difficult. But yeah, I think this quote that I put in the chat, that's referring to sort of, you know, this cultural effect. So if we think about, what is the world of Buddhism going to be like in 50 years, in, the case where we manage to translate, in two different ways, two different options for the future, which way is it going to go? So one is where we translate still with these, these very psychologically based understandings of everything. And so when we're thinking of what does this mean, then we compare it to a sort of a Western psychological understanding of the mind, and we say, oh, that must be like this, they're referring to this, and so that's how we translate it. And the other way would be is, to not use those. So that first way, maybe we would be using lots of Western words, and we would be saying things like wisdom, and not using prajna and things like this. And if we maybe thought of an idea of how to translate that was, not doing that, then we might need to use lots of transliterations like, prajna, karma, all these sort of things, because we accept that we cannot find a Western concept that matches that. So we just leave the word there. If we think about those two alternatives, how does that affect, over a course of sort of 50 years, 100 years, how does that affect the cultural transmission of Buddhism?
Well, I might venture to guess that if we were to make it more use more the words wisdom instead of prajna and all that, I think it could probably make Buddhism easier to kind of tap into at least at the beginning, right? Like to just make it more understandable and relatable to the culture to which it was translated, of course, right? So it's something that just makes more sense if you read a page, the same page, and it's on the two options. The one that probably will read easier, it'll be easier on the reader, will be that one, right? But then I think one of the most important questions, at least that I think arises, and that is, are you able to translate the meaning correctly into these new words? Because if you're not, then it is a pseudo new, it does start to become like a new agey Buddhism, a new agey something that doesn't really convey the meaning or the blessings or everything that goes into it. So at least for me, the two options would be that if it's translated, it could be tapped into easier, but there is the risk of it losing a lot of its power once you really get into it, because you wouldn't get an explanation on what prajna really means or what this really means or all of that. You couldn't get that, and I think on the other hand, if you go more for the transliteration and using those words, I think it's also open to some misinterpretation, and it could become more scholarly somehow.
Okay.
I don't know if that's an insult or not, but
depends who you're talking to, doesn't it? Yeah. What about the others? What do you think?
Until now, I've only, translated. I see as a servant myself. I've been asked to do something for a certain purpose, and you do it. But I haven't questioned the. It's never been a decision, of mine. Like, I want to translate this because I believe this should be done like this. So there was a purpose to the texts. Somebody asked me, can you do this? So it's very purpose related. So that question of the long term, of the thing of Buddhism, I think it goes beyond the words, but probably words have an influence of whether Buddhism becomes another well-being possibility. Reading Buddhism books and buying courses, you know, is like another thing to feel a little bit better, less stressed, and produce more at work. I think the way translations are made obviously have an influence, but I think the way words are influenced depends on who commands the translations. So there's already a purpose in the way we translate. So is it to present the texts? Is it, what is? You know, I think it all comes back to that motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the purpose is to make text that helps people feel better, then you obviously are going to use a vocabulary that is not too complicated, that they are familiar with. But if you want to present the texts the way they are, even with their challenging things, I don't know. I have this feeling that it depends really on what is the objective. Or is it to practice? Is it to feel better? Is it to practice, like Dzongzar Khyentse Rinpoche, practice to deconstruct your ego, which is not necessarily a pleasant thing, always. So I don't know. I see Buddhism could take that direction of becoming another product sold to feel a little bit more comfortable. Is a possibility. Why not? You know, if it's what is people are wanting, why not? I think it's going to depend on people and how they use these texts, what we want them for, really.
Okay. Yeah, interesting answer. Katarina, what's your answer? What's like two cultures going to look like in 50 years' time, and these two alternative futures?
I was thinking about the choice of words, right? Because you were giving the example of Prajna. But I mean, if our languages allow for a very similar idea, we could try that. I mean, even if we, in some circumstances, you keep the original word. But even, for instance, when you think of Prajna in Tibetan, then you have several words, right, for wisdom. And we have our choices in Portuguese. We actually, in our exercise that we are doing, in our translation, the Manjushri praise, I was actually thinking about how can I change, if I can change, use wisdom, knowledge, because in Portuguese, like probably in Spanish, is the same. We have the same words, I think. The Latin root is there. But the English is a bit different, right? In German probably is the same, like wisdom, I don't know where it comes from, or knowledge. But in Portuguese and Spanish, in Latin, yes, conhecer, knowledge might be more connected to the Latin word, more related to the cognitive processes, cognoscencia, cognoscer, to know and knowledge, but it's very close. And then we have the knowing, which is a saber, that gives sabedoria, which is wisdom. Saber, sabedoria. It's wisdom, but it's very in the same line with knowledge. And then you have another word. You have other words connected to this, which is sapiencia, which is a great knowledge, which comes from the same root. And then you have omniscience, which comes from the root of the knowledge. So, so you have so many words. Let's try and pick one. Or Prajna. If it's not possible, then keep Prajna. But if you can, you have to use 2 words. Why not use 2 words if you want? But I mean, we have a lot of words to try to choose. But I don't know. I mean, it has to be a balance between what is in the source and what will be in the target. In it is a negotiation, right? But I don't know. Maybe it's the context where words are used is also important, right? It's not just a word that you keep the prajna. Maybe the context where the prajna is, how you write a sentence, is also important, right?
Yeah, and I'm sort of trying to get you to think even wider context than that as well. So sort of, you know, we talked about the strategy of the whole text that you're translating, or even the sort of strategy or the reasons why you are a translator. Nerea was talking about your motivation, things like this. And then also just sort of within what sort of community or movement are you doing this? You know, do you see yourself as part of some historical enterprise, or do you just see yourself as an individual translating a text? But also the whole cultural effect. So I was trying to get us to think a little bit sort of bigger. Thinking back to this sort of observation, which of course is looking back. So, you know, we it's very difficult to think about this when you're in the middle of it, like we are now. You know, it's same with the COVID pandemic. You know, it feels very different being in the middle of a pandemic to reading about the 1918 flu pandemic. You know, it's you can look back at history and you can sort of think, wow, that was, you know, terrible, all those people dying, you know, and there was all sorts of restrictions on their lives, and now you're sort of in the middle of it and you're like, oh, this is what it feels like. Actually, I'm just trying to go on with my life, you know, I just want to go to the pub and the cinema, you know. But in 50 years, people will be writing about the 2020 COVID pandemic, you know, and lockdowns and societal upheavals and how it changed society forever, and everybody now communicates via video screens, and before that nobody did, and things like this. So, you know, there are all sorts of, you know, difficulties in taking this historical perspective. But what I'm trying to sort of get you to think about is, let us, you know, imagine, but it's not really an imagine, but let us just assume that, you know, Tibetan, we'll ignore for the moment that Buddhism is Indian, but let's just simplify the argument. You know, Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhist culture, let us just say for the moment it is very different, you know, to our culture. And let us just for the sake of this sort of little exercise, let us say that our culture is very you know, psychological in the sense of Jungian and all these sort of psychological ways of thinking we have now, based, you know, if we look at this sort of exotic Tibetan thing, and we always look for the parallels, and we look and we say, oh, I want to understand this. How can I understand this? It's very different. And then I think, oh, well, actually, what they're saying there, that must be the same as what Jung meant when he said this, you know. So this concept of Sherab or Prajna, you know, that must be the same as sort of discerning wisdom, what, you know, whatever. So we sort of, we constantly make these sort of bridges to what we are now, in order to understand the other, you know, the Tibetan Buddhist thought.
It's not a bridge that you're doing there, Craig. That's
Say
not
again?
a bridge. That's not a bridge you are establishing. You're taking your view and putting it on the other presentation.
Okay,
Can
good.
you explain it differently? Yeah, is it that, or the thing is we are limited in what we understand of other, but what do we know? That's one thing. Until there, I understand. But if you say that you use your concepts to introduce foreign concepts, that's different to say. You see what I mean?
Yes,
it's different to say, I can only see from my point of view, but I try to keep it open to see if other meanings are possible, than saying it is somehow related, so it must be the same.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I'm deliberately making an extreme case so that we can compare them. What I suppose the question I'm trying to ask is, how do I give, in this case, the Tibetan Buddhist sort of thought, how do I give that the chance to change me? Not me personally, but me, my culture. Like, when we read this quote, somehow, over the course of centuries, this Greek thought did change the Arabic Islamic culture and inspire it to then go on and become immensely great. I mean, the history of the Arabic Islamic culture, the sciences, they took the Greek thought and they developed it, phenomenally. So this was a change which happened. Our scholar here is saying that, part of that change was because they took the time to find these neologisms, to find ways of expressing this in their sort of emic, in their own way, rather than always treating it as something Greek, as using a transliteration. So if I'm always thinking of karma and prajna, that is sort of, let us say, to be very simple, that my culture then thinks of this other culture as being something very different, and that could have advantages and disadvantages.
I think the way to find a neologism is to know what you're speaking about. It's as simple as that. And I think in the Dharma terms, there are so many that I don't know exactly what it means. I suppose the day I'm in the 10th Bhumi, I'll be able to start translating a little bit properly. Really, I do believe that until then, I don't know exactly what I'm talking about. Most of the things, lack of knowledge, lack of total fluency of the context, the language. So in that sense, I think transliteration is useful, but because of our lack of knowledge. But I'm sure the day there's many, many people in the West being enlightened and knowing exactly what they're talking about and knowing, perfectly these texts, it will be much easier to find words in our languages.
And we've come back to the sort of level of words again and translating individual terms. And I mean, partly because I didn't succeed in keeping it up at that level of the culture when I was talking about it.
Even in the original languages, books are written and concepts are there. It's not that you are experienced them. I mean, if you speak of the absolute truth, or you can say the words, you're not saying it wrongly, and you translate them quite simply. They are not difficult to translate. It's not that the Tibetan person or the Indian person knows what is absolute truth. even in their own languages, with their own words. So that challenge of what I can grasp or not, it's from one culture or another, it's not different in a way when you think about Buddhism, right? Or what is being transmitted in Buddhism.
Is it? I mean, this is sort of part of what
And
I'm
probably
trying to
what
ask
happened
is.
in the West, when you think about how Buddhism appealed to Western people, was because it was not so much a question of a culture, but it was much more of what it meant for Western people. It was a proposal of something that you could do, and it's not so much connected to religious stuffs, which is practicing the mind, training the mind. Like so, this is a tool that still today. I mean, I worked at the Buddhist Union, and I know people that go there for, and it's not just the Buddhist Union, it can be any center with Buddhist people, orienting meditation sessions, and people go because they want to have a tool. They don't want to be Buddhists. So this is an example that I use a lot, because it is true that Buddhism per se, it's not the culture that is there, Tibetan or Indian. It's something that is not defined by culture. It's telling you, okay, you can train your mind, and your mind doesn't have it has a culture, but the mind, if you're training your mind, you can be Indian or it can be whatever you want. So that was the appeal of Buddhism. It was not the cultural. I mean, now we are learning Tibetan. The language, it has lots of cultural nuances. But when it comes to Buddhism, there's something there which is not cultural bounded, right? So it's...
How do you get to that without... So, you know, this non-culturally bound aspect of Buddhism was nonetheless, you know, being written about by Tibetans living in whatever century they were living in. So the text you have in front of you has that within it, what Katarina has just described, but it is nonetheless within some other sort of packaging and coloring and you know that. So how do you distinguish between that, and then what do you do with it here? Because you have to write a text, so you have to put a packaging and a coloring on it, because you know you cannot write this neutral. I mean, a master, a lama who is teaching in a teaching session, of course, can transmit that to us, even with perfect English or with broken English or Spanish or whatever, but they can transmit that to us. But you're writing a text on a page which is going to have some form of packaging. So, you know, on an individual level, how do you do that? But on a sort of a wider cultural level, how do you, you know, embody that and recognize that what you are part of is you are part of something which will have an effect on your society in 50 years' time?
Yeah. I mean, I asked Mathieu Ricard when he talked to us, one of the days, the talk, if he saw something in this, if it would have an impact in translation. The fact that we are now at the point where we are. Buddhism is another thing from it was in the 50s, quite different. And now we are going to another phase. It was the globalization, everything. Well, it didn't answer. He didn't say. He didn't think. He didn't. I don't think he thought much about it. But he said, "Oh no, I don't know. I don't know. Probably not." But it's true. We are. When you think about the crossing, this interdependence between the coming of Buddhism to the West and how it's going to develop, certainly is going to change, because how it was in the 50s it's going to be something different in 100 years, right? So, but to know what is going to happen, well, I don't know, but probably the cultural traits will be, but we think we always, the Western people went to India, right? A lot, and to Asia in general, to get in touch and to come back again.
Yeah.
But this is a process that has, it's a very recent process, right? It's not so much widely, but things have changed since then, because now we are all connected, much more connected instantly. So it's much easier to get in touch with the different cultures. So probably in the West, we are much more going to be in contact with the differences in terms of Buddhism, of what we got from Buddhism at the beginning, and now what we are going to get from now on, with more translations, with more connection with the cultures, with the different cultures.
Going a little bit, Greg, on what you were saying about trying to get on the Tibetans being like having a certain kind of cultureless Buddhism within a culture, right? Like having that aspect within a culture. I think we could use that as an example to how hopefully it could change the culture here. Because if of course if we compare the Buddhism in Tibet versus Buddhism in India when it was flourishing, they look quite different in many aspects of the cultural part. But we know that there were that there was success in both. That there were beings people who were able to really to really go through with it in both types of culture. So I think going back to your question of how culturally it would change here, I think that necessarily they would have to be a transposition of kind of taking all of those things, the kind of the essential culturalist things, and in a way putting them into our culture, in a way, in the same way that Tibet did, in the same way that Tibet, maybe like, I don't know, it's maybe it's not the greatest example, but like the prayer flags and the prayer wheels and all of that is something that happened within Tibet. Of course, it's a very little example, but if you compare that and how they were able to do things or the types of retreats they did, or the things that are based on where they were, geography, the cold there and all of that, and if we are to transport that into what we're doing here, well then hopefully maybe, I don't know, our mandala offerings have computers and planes and all of those things, which is something that I've heard Sanso Khyentse Rinpoche talk about, of how he applauds, for example, Trungpa Rinpoche for starting that process of changing, of trying to put the real essential like drops of Dharma and putting them into our culture, in Trungpa's case, of course, the US, but of how he was trying to push that in certain things, and how Sanso Khyentse Rinpoche still now says, I still don't dare to do what somebody like Trungpa Rinpoche was doing, of really pushing that envelope and trying to create an American Buddhism, or a Mexican Buddhism, or a British Buddhism. And I think just because of how we are, how we process things and how we relate to things, I don't think it's possible to do it any other way. I don't think you could really offer, like, pass on a cultureless Dharma, because how do you relate to that? I think you would have to be in one of, I don't know, it would make it another type of Dharma transmission, right? So I think it has to be into that, and with that, of course, the neologisms and all that have to grow. But of course, as Katarina was saying, it's still quite early, and I think hopefully with time we can get there.
I agree. Hopefully, yeah. Nerea,
I
what do
mean,
you have?
so that it's the images that you use of contemporary art in the book, the Bourbon one, isn't the Bourbon one?
The Guru
The
drinks.
contemporary art, an art which is still difficult for many of Western people who don't like conceptual art. He uses them. He uses them very well. I mean, he is quite aware of Western art, and you know, it matches. But probably for many people, this is horrible to use. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, our readers are not uniform, you know. I mean, they might all be, you know, Westerners or Mexicans or whatever they may all be, but they're all different, aren't they? So some of them will understand the conceptual art metaphor, others won't. So it's same as the Tibetan readers, you know, they were all different as well. So, you know. You have any thoughts, Nerea?
It's difficult to think in terms of society in such a big terms, I think, because I see practice as an individual decision thing to do with others and in the context of others. But all the things I've been asked to translate in terms of Dharma mainly have been individual instructions, practice for one person. But I was trying to think, how does it feel like you are in a bigger thing? Like the question you're asking, do you feel part of a bigger thing? Probably when a person tells you it's so inspiring to read these instructions on death. And you're part of, that person, you know, feeling that is helpful, that text, and can have this intimate relationship with the text. But I have really difficulties in seeing it in terms of society, but I've never translated a book for many, you know, so I've only have this experience of, in terms of translating these texts, and the others, text, a newsletter, or is information, doesn't really matter, you know, people get the information, but I feel there is a difference in the way, of course, the impact it has, you know, translating Dharma text on how to work with the mind, how to learn to reflect, to analyze, and translating other types of text. So I still find it difficult to think any bigger than that. I find it's like one drop to help one person in 1 minute, and that's it. But it's like a little wave to expand, maybe. Yeah.
And have you translated something, a text, a full text, Craig, for a Buddhist text?
No, I mean, it's not as a. Let me think.
In your other
No, I think, but what is perhaps more relevant to tell is, you know, in 2009, I went out to Bir to become an English teacher at the Dzongsa Kshetra. And before my work started, I spent a few weeks at Deer Park, just sort of acclimatizing and arriving and getting ready. And I had to leave my room there because Deer Park was being cleared because the big conference was happening where they were inviting lots of lamas and lots of translators to discuss this new idea of translating the Buddhist canon. So I was just like, oh, I have to move. So I, had to go down to the Shredder a week early and move into a room that was still being painted and things because I had to get out of Deer Park. So that was sort of, for me, just this, I have to move, and all these important people are coming to Deer Park. But then over the years, I ended up helping Ngawang Chenli with the early days of Visukia, and thinking about becoming a translator myself, deciding that my Tibetan was never going to be good enough to do that, so I decided not to pursue that path, but still being interested in Tibetan, and still keeping sort of an eye and watching this Buddhist literary heritage project become 84,000, and then this becoming sort of like worldwide, and and then now they have the projects in China getting the Chinese Tibetan translations happening, and the original idea was eventually, if we get enough translations into English, then they can also go into other languages. And now I'm sitting here helping people who want to translate things into Spanish and Portuguese, and it's sort of developing an awareness of what I'm part of, and I haven't really done very much at all. I just been looking at it really, but still, realizing, okay, so this is really is something quite big, and Songtse Khyentse Rinpoche said that right from the start. He was like, right at that very first conference, was saying, well, when the Tibetans wanted to translate all these texts, they had kings who sort of said, okay, how many translators do we need? 300, right? Yeah, okay, feed them. Who's going to do that now? So this was the big question, was this is going to take 50 years, A, we don't have enough translators, and B, even if we did, we don't have any money to pay them. So how are we going to do this? And so it is a big thing. And when you sit down and you write down, how many texts and how many words and how many years that took, and you compare that to anything that I've been involved in on a commercial level, even when a big organization translates all of its texts and things, it's a phenomenal task. But I mean, Nerea, you've been somewhere near the EU and all this translation work that goes on there, and that is also a huge amount of work that is, when you think about the translation needs of the EU, that's
the difference is but that's the why I couldn't see what you were talking about, because in the EU there's a political will to consider all languages so important. So it's a decision, and for translating Dharma texts, I don't feel there is that urge and that will. I don't see it. I see it, some individuals wanting to practice or needing to practice and reading the texts in their languages, but I don't see the people who have the power, the money, who could support. I don't see it as a priority in most centers, for example. You see, they build more buildings than translators.
But if we think back to what Katarina has already been saying sort of earlier on in our session today, where she was talking about the Buddhism becoming a business, and things like this, we are part of something which has been going on for at least 50 years and longer, really, but certainly been building up speed, so that the messages within Buddhism, in their own way and in perhaps diluted and perhaps distorted forms, are being put into practice on a day-to-day basis in the biggest companies in the world. there are staff programs for mindfulness at the biggest companies in the world. The Harvard Business School, the top business school for the capitalists, in the US, have a whole session in their MBA on, mindfulness and things like this. The value of introspection and whatever it may be, how is all termed. So, we're in that wave, even if there isn't this sort of one political decision that was made by anyone. There's sort of, it's not just an exercise that I'm giving you in a training course to think about what it's going to look like in 50 years. It's reality. In 50 years, people will be writing, just like this scholar wrote this quote about the change in, Arabic Islamic culture. Scholars will be writing about the wave of Buddhism. I mean, they already are, of course, but you know what I mean. So, translation is part of that, especially, everything that you've all been talking about, this afternoon, that sort of has increasing, with all the globalization, with all the contact between the different cultures. Yeah, that's sort of the message of this last part of the session. We're running out of time, but I hope that was, an attempt to sort of pull you a little bit away from, how do we translate Prajna, to sort of like, why do I even have to think about how I translate Prajna? What effect is it, going to have? And also these quotes that we've been reading, about the deference to the past and the use of neologisms, and, all of these decisions are made within these wider contexts, so that's certainly the message that I get out of this chapter that we're reading now, so.
Thank you, it's good to be reminded. We lose this bigger view and you're with your thing.
Yeah.
Of course.
Apparently in the book that you have access, the Routledge tool that you have, there's more quotations from Saint Jerome and maybe Cicero or one. If you can get that, if you can copy paste.
Okay.
I don't know. It would be nice just to have some more quotes, because probably we are not going to have time to have a lot of study now with other things that we have to do with the Tibet.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you can just take them for us.
Yeah. I just stumbled across a paper in Spanish about the Arabic translator. So I'll send that to our Spanish speakers.
Yeah, cool.
Maybe, I don't know, obviously it looked like one that was cited by a few people, so hopefully it's good quality. It might not be, but I can't judge.
Yeah.
But yes, I'll try and access those other documents and send them through. If you want to carry on reading the rest of chapter 2, then we will carry on with this, going into the slightly more modern times. It will be similar next week. After that, I have an idea for sort of a special session where we might be looking at sort of teamwork in translation. It seems to me that in the book, there's a lot of talk about the translator, as if it's sort of one person. But everything, certainly, I don't think it was always like that. And, even reading about this Arabic translator, whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce, but, he sort of got his nephew and his brother to help him. And, and you are embedded in this sort of team principle with the scholars your advisors and things. So I think we'll spend a special session looking at that either the week after next or very soon.
Nice.
Drupchen hasn't turned up, and I'm certainly not qualified to lead the prayers, so I think we have to skip that or do that individually today.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
And
next week.
yeah, I'll see you next week. Any questions or comments to finish with?
Yeah, I like reading about the history.
Yeah.
I do enjoy it. It gives you kind of like a view of just kind of how it developed. I like it. It's nice.
Mm. Yeah. I like the, particularly at the moment, this chapter is really sort of trying to get us away from this sort of polar debate between word for word or free, and sort of to show us that the question is a lot more sort of rich than just this sort of, so I like that part of this chapter especially. Yeah.
Very interesting, and it's bringing a lot of questions and thinking about. Yeah.
Nice. I can see it.
Anyway, we always have to think when you think of being embedded in a Christian culture, and then we are always trying to, confronted with using words that are very so much charged in the Christian context. But sometimes it's not because of the poor word that is being used. I mean, the word has no fault that is being used in one culture or the other. But it's true that we can use sometimes words, but because they are so Christian in there. But,
Yeah, I've had a few. Yeah, I've had a few discussions. Yeah, with people, because I'm not particularly Christian, and because also I'm a linguist, so I tend to see a word and then, track it back. So I will often sort of say, yeah, but that word originally before the Christians, or it can also mean, and everyone else is no, the first thing anyone thinks of when they see that word is this Christian concept, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's a shame. as Katarina just said, it wasn't the word's fault. But yeah, it's a fascinating. I love the job. I love translating because of these questions. So okay, then I'll see you next week.
Yes.
See you next week.
Bye bye.
See you next week.
See ya.